Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the warm welcome to New Zealand. As part of my medical education at the University of Queensland, I had the opportunity to undertake a literature review looking at Indigenous health, smoking, and advertisement campaigns targeting smoking. Today I'd like to discuss with you some of the findings of my report. We'll start by looking at the prevalence and impact of smoking on Indigenous communities. Then we'll discuss some of the determinants and attitudes which underpin smoking behaviours in the Indigenous population. We'll talk about some of the advertising campaigns that targeted these behaviours. And finally, I'll talk about how this research has impacted on my understanding of the competencies of mass and cross-cultural communication. Australia has some of the lowest rates of smoking in the world. Smoking rates for Australia have declined rapidly over recent years, from 34% in 1980 to 16.6% in 2007. Consequently, one of the biggest factors contributing to Australia's high life expectancy is this low rate of smoking. However, this is not the case for Indigenous Australians. 1 in 2 Indigenous Australians are currently smoking, and this number has only recently started to decrease in the past decade. 2 in 3 Indigenous households are smoking households. Indigenous Australians also make fewer quitting attempts and are less successful at quitting than the general population. Furthermore, the rate of uptake of smoking is earlier and much higher amongst Indigenous children, with the decision to smoke usually taken between the ages of 12 to 16. Smoking rates for Indigenous 15 to 24-year-olds in 2008 were double that of the general population. As such, the Indigenous smoking problem can be summarised as smoking early, smoking longer, and quitting later. The current high prevalence of Indigenous smoking can be traced back through history. There is evidence of Indigenous Australians in Central Australia chewing native tobacco plants containing nicotine 2,000 years ago. Modern tobacco was introduced to Northern Australia via Indonesian fishermen 400 years ago. The widespread implementation of tobacco usage in Australia occurred following colonisation. In the decades that followed, and as Indigenous people were displaced from their cultural lands onto church, government, and private missions, there was increasing tobacco usage as tobacco was traded for employment. Tobacco use was often encouraged as a means of controlling the native population and civilising them via nicotine dependence. Smoking has since become normalised in many Indigenous communities, given that the high prevalence rate of smoking, although this is not linked to any cultural practices of smoking in the Indigenous population. Additionally, Aboriginal people have a strong tradition of sharing resources through the kinship system, and this promotes smoking behaviours. The most important factors associated with the high rates of smoking appear to be linked to socioeconomic factors such as unemployment, low education, low income, housing status, and living in areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. The process of colonisation of Aboriginal people and the resulting family separation and loss of land and culture has led to a large difference in socioeconomic status between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. These factors, together with the impact of racial discrimination, increase the susceptibility to the stresses that causes high levels of tobacco use. There are certain factors such as emotions, pleasures, stress, habits, and addictions which drive all people to smoke. Amongst Indigenous people, there are additional factors which drive smoking behaviours. Firstly, in many communities, smoking is a normalised behaviour. Smoking is seen as an everyday cultural practice that is acceptable. Socialising around smoking activity and sharing tobacco are crucial for maintaining social relationships and maintaining cohesion within communities. It is often seen people trading cigarettes as a means of encouraging favours and resolving disputes. Secondly, smoking is seen as a lesser vice. Despite being well aware of the general negative consequences of smoking, many Indigenous individuals view smoking as an acceptable alternative to other drug use, such as alcohol and cannabis, which tends to be prevalent amongst lower socioeconomic and disadvantaged communities. Thirdly, smoking is often used as a coping mechanism and self-medication for the stresses associated with being disadvantaged. The normalisation and socialisation aspects of smoking produce a significant hurdle for quitters to overcome as they attempt to give up this behaviour. Starting with the National Warning Against Tobacco campaign in 1972 and continuing through the National Tobacco campaign in 1990, the social marketing against tobacco has produced significant cultural changes amongst the Australian population. Targeting smokers aged 18 to 40 years with a lower socioeconomic bias, the program was a highly cost-effective measure which discouraged smoking uptake amongst teenagers and encouraged quitting via national TV advertisements, radio advertisements, along with billboards, posters and pamphlet drops. Between 1997 and 2000, one of the most active periods of the campaign, prevalence of cigarette smoking dropped by 3.1% in the general population, resulting in $750 million worth of savings. However, these benefits did not extend to the Indigenous population. Research by Johnson and Thomas and Boyle and colleagues found that there was similar levels of awareness of campaign advertisements and message takeout between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. However, smoking was not perceived as a major health concern, and quitting intention was observed to be much lower amongst Indigenous communities. The individual negative health impacts highlighted by the National Tobacco Campaign were not seen as significant as a significant quitting motivator compared to the social and stress relief benefits associated with smoking in an Indigenous context. Many Indigenous people felt that the message was not relevant for their local context. For the New Zealanders in the crowd, this campaign, the National Tobacco Campaign, utilised images such as esophaguses, brains, and dissected throats to look at the impact cigarette smoking has on these organs, and it was developed in conjunction with some of the leading clinicians in Australia. As you can see, the images are quite graphic. After the failure of the National Tobacco Campaign, research was undertaken by several institutions to identify how social marketing could be improved to reach Indigenous Australians. A 2010 national study found that the key motivators for smoking cessation amongst Indigenous people were the importance of family and kin and the impact of secondhand smoking on them, particularly on young children, supporting self-efficacy in the quitting process, and the cost of smoking, particularly as it impacts the family. This new direction in mass communication can be seen in the Break the Chain series of advertisements, where the focus is now on utilising Indigenous actors to discuss social benefits of quitting, such as less health effects to young children, otitis media and that sort of a thing, and family budgets, as opposed to focusing on the individual detrimental health impacts that smoking can have on each person. The benefits of this new social approach will be investigated in upcoming years, but early results show promise. In terms of competencies, what I got out of my literature review and what I hope you'll get out of my presentation today is the importance of targeting your communication to the appropriate cultural context of your target audience. Effective health promotion and communication initiatives adopt an audience-centered perspective, such that the promotion and communication activities reflect audiences' preferred formats, channels, and contexts. These considerations are particularly relevant for racial and ethnic populations who have different language sources, differences in languages and sources of information. In these cases, public education campaigns must be conceptualized and developed with specific knowledge of the cultural characteristics, media habits, and language preferences of your target audience. If smoking is understood as a socially and culturally patterned behaviour, then the differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in history, social and cultural differences, and attitudes to health suggest that initiatives which may be successful in one community may not be transferable to Indigenous contexts without at least some degree of modification. Tobacco action within Aboriginal communities must incorporate approaches that take into account the socio-economic realities of people's lives and unique social and cultural contexts, as well as considering how to overcome the challenges within the health delivery system that may contribute to reducing the effectiveness of tobacco action initiatives. In my own clinical experiences, I've found being aware of the local Indigenous context to be valuable for instigating behavioural change. During my remote Indigenous placement, I came face to face with many Indigenous smokers. However, given that I was aware of the local and social context of smoking, I was able to tailor my motivational interviewing techniques to better suit my Indigenous patients. I focused on the social benefits as the main motivator to quitting, as opposed to lecturing patients on the detrimental health effects that each individual may face. I was able to better understand the social barriers facing the Indigenous people wishing to quit, and I was able to offer better alternative resources for these patients to utilise, such as Aboriginal health workers, local elders who have quit in the past, and local quitting support networks that were there in the community that I was at. I discussed the normalisation of smoking and how smoking is not a normalised behaviour in the general Australian population. I discussed the importance of smoking and how it can contribute to other health problems which may be of higher priority to these patients, such as financial disadvantage. Overall, adopting this cultural specific communication in my motivational interviewing enabled me to motivate my patients in a more effective manner. Ultimately, knowing the circumstances around Indigenous smoking enabled me to empathise and communicate better with my patients, and I hope that the brief overview that I've provided you today will enable you to better communicate with your patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ridhwan. Do we have any questions for Ridhwan?
Thank you. It's a very thoughtful way of reflecting on your practice. As a result of what you learned through this piece of work, would you provide any advice to the people designing your communication skills in your medical course that you did?
Sure. In my course, the focus of communication is usually on the standard Australian population. There's not much added cultural relevance training provided. We usually have the standard lectures talking about the history of Indigenous Australians and some of the impacts of colonisation, but we don't usually. I find that some of my colleagues and I will gloss over all these dot points and historical contexts without thinking much about how it relates to our practice. So I think when we do train in motivational interviewing or communicating bad news, it'd be much more effective to incorporate Indigenous patients within the stock patients that we receive, so that we can actually utilise these lessons, these cultural lessons that we're meant to learn, and actually implement them in practice, so that these facts don't just wash over as part of the Indigenous health module of the course, but stay relevant in our minds when we are practicing. I find that we focus on our Indigenous health module in year 1 of our course, and by year 3, when we're actually practicing in the wards and come face to face with Indigenous patients, that information tends to get missing. So having Indigenous patients be a part of the standard assessment criteria and recycling Indigenous cases through those assessments would keep the lessons that we learned and the cultural training that we have fresh in our minds when we approach 3rd year.
Ridhwan, if you had more time, what sort of extension to this study would you do?
Extension? Sure. Well, we've looked at the sort of context around smoking, but as I've mentioned, that Indigenous health, the Indigenous patients usually feel more strongly about alcohol as a major issue facing the communities. As I said, smoking gets relegated behind alcohol, given that alcohol has links with domestic violence and community unrest. So I'd like to see how media portrayal of alcohol differs between Indigenous contexts and the rest of Australia. Maybe not just looking at public health campaigns targeting drinking, but also looking at the other side, the commercial advertisements targeting drinking and how that relates to Indigenous contexts. But yeah, I think that would be my next logical extension.
Just a quick comment, I guess, Ridhwan. Thank you for that presentation. I think you touched on an important point there about the use of a public health or population health intervention and its unexpected effects on increase inequalities, even if it can be effective in doing the overall aim of decreasing smoking. And this actually extends across many aspects of medicine and clinical practice. So, well done.
Thank you.